Night has fallen on Sinai, and the camp below is still. Fires burn in rings across the dark. On the mountain, beyond the sight of the people, Moses is not only receiving laws for a wandering nation. In the world imagined by the Book of Jubilees, he is being shown the architecture of time itself. The voice that instructs him does not begin with a small matter. It reaches back to creation, to the ordering of days, to the first family, the flood, the covenants, and the long road that has brought Israel to this mountain. The tension at the center of the book is sharp from the start. If sacred history has an order set in heaven, what happens when human beings keep time badly, remember badly, and live as though the pattern does not matter? That is the first thing to understand about Jubilees. It is not a loose collection of legends, and it is not merely a colorful retelling of Genesis. It presents itself as revelation, spoken to Moses during the 40 days on Sinai by the angel of the presence, a figure who stands near God and mediates divine instruction. The book then retells the story from creation to the arrival of Israel near Canaan, but it does so with a purpose. Events are dated, generations are measured, festivals are fixed, names omitted in Genesis are supplied, old episodes are sharpened into moral and theological lessons. The past is not being repeated for atmosphere, it is being arranged, almost like stone courses in a wall, to show that the covenant world has a pattern, and that pattern was never meant to drift. Its title reflects that concern. In Ethiopian tradition, it is known as Mashafa Kufale, the Book of Division, because history is divided into ordered periods, especially Jubilees, cycles of 49 years. The author treats time as structured, counted, and morally charged. That alone tells us we are standing in the world of Second Temple Judaism, a world where scripture was read intensely, where communities argued about purity and law, and where the right ordering of worship was no minor question. In that setting, a calendar was not just a calendar. It was an argument about authority. It was a claim about creation. It was a decision about whether earthly worship would mirror heaven or not. The Book of Jubilees likely took shape in the 2nd century before Christ, long after Moses, in a period when Jewish life was under pressure from competing powers, internal divisions, and changing habits. That historical fact matters. The book speaks in the voice of Moses, but scholars place its composition much later, and that is not a scandal unless someone mistakes genre for deception. Ancient writers often taught through revered figures. By placing its teaching on Sinai, Jubilees does something bold. It argues that the questions troubling its own age are not new at all. They go back to the beginning. The disputes over Sabbath, festivals, purity, intermarriage, priesthood, and the authority of inherited tradition are written into the deep grain of sacred history, and yet, the book has never sat comfortably in every community. Most Jewish and Christian traditions outside Ethiopia did not keep it in their canon. Rabbinic Judaism took other paths. Most Western churches inherited a Bible without it, but exclusion did not erase influence. Jubilees belongs to the family of texts that help us hear the sound of ancient Jewish thought around the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. It opens a door into a mental world where angels keep festivals, demons trouble households, Noah receives remedies, Abraham rejects idols before he ever leaves home, and Israel's ritual life is understood as part of a cosmic order older than Sinai itself. So the question that drives this story is not simply whether Jubilees should be in somebody's Bible. That debate came later, and it is not the most interesting place to begin. The deeper question is why this book was written with such urgency, why some communities treasured it, and why its vision of time, covenant, and heavenly order still feels so charged. A forgotten text can be harmless. Jubilees was never harmless. It asks whether history is just a chain of events, or whether the world has been divided, measured, and claimed by God from the first day onward. Chapter 2 long after the book claimed to speak on Sinai, it survived in places far from the Judean wilderness. That survival is one of the reasons it still commands attention. For many centuries, complete forms of the text were preserved above all in Ethiopic, within the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, where Jubilees endured not as a curiosity, but as scripture read within a living tradition. In much of the West, that fact alone seemed strange. A book, forgotten in one branch of the biblical world, had been carefully kept in another. The map of Christian memory was broader than many later readers assumed. Then came the 20th century and the caves near Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not merely produce new fragments for scholars to file away. They changed the conversation about whole bodies of literature, once treated as late inventions or marginal fantasies. Among the scrolls were multiple copies of Jubilees in Hebrew, enough to show that this was no medieval Ethiopian oddity. It was known, copied and valued in Jewish communities before the rise of Christianity. That does not settle questions of canon, but it does settle something important. Jubilees belonged to the real library of Second Temple Judaism. It was part of the air some ancient readers breathed. That setting explains much about its tone. The world behind Jubilees is not casual about scripture. It is rigorous, interpretive, and deeply concerned with order. The author reads Genesis and Exodus, but he does not read them passively. He expands them, clarifies them, and sometimes presses them toward conclusions that fit a stricter theological vision. Modern scholars often call this kind of writing rewritten Bible, though the label can sound colder than the practice really was. To ancient readers, this was not vandalism. It was interpretation by retelling. If a text was believed to contain divine wisdom, then its silences invited reflection. Its chronology invited completion. Its laws invited extension into daily life. That is why Jubilees speaks so firmly. It does not sound like a neutral archive. It sounds like a voice in an argument. Somewhere behind its polished chronology stands a real conflict over how Israel should live and who had the right to define faithfulness. The book opposes mixture, blurring, and drift. It hardens boundaries. It connects piety with correct practice. It treats the patriarchs less as wandering ancestors and more as early guardians of truths later generations have endangered. That is a familiar instinct in times of instability. When the present feels compromised, writers often go back to origins and rebuild authority there. The Ethiopian preservation of the book and the Qumran fragments together create a remarkable frame. Ethiopia shows continuity of reception. Qumran shows ancient Jewish esteem. Between those two witnesses, Jubilees can no longer be dismissed as a late fantasy with no roots. At the same time, responsible reading requires balance. The book is ancient, but ancient does not automatically mean canonical for every community. It is important, but importance is not the same as universal authority. That distinction matters, and Jubilees itself almost forces us to practice it. It asks for respect without demanding that every reader erase the long history of debate surrounding it. Still, debate is not the same thing as irrelevance. In fact, controversy is part of why the book matters. Jubilees reveals a Judaism alive, with competing visions of time, law, identity, and mediation between heaven and earth. It reminds us that the biblical world did not move in a single straight line from Moses to the rabbis, or from prophets to church fathers. There were branches, arguments, experiments in fidelity, and communities convinced that the center had wandered. Jubilees is one of the clearest voices from that contested landscape. And before we ever ask whether it should be accepted, we have to hear what it is trying to save. Chapter 3. The heart of Jubilees is not a hidden code or a lost tribe. It is a calendar. That may sound almost disappointingly ordinary, until one sees how much hangs on it. In Chapter 6, the book insists that the year is to be kept as 364 days, a complete cycle of 52 exact weeks. The force of that claim is easy to miss in a modern world that treats calendars as practical tools. In Jubilees, the calendar is theology. It is obedience. It is the visible form of sacred order. The text describes the year through 4 quarters of 91 days, each quarter made of 13 weeks. That detail matters because later popular summaries often smooth the system into something simpler than the book itself presents. What matters most to the author is not mathematical elegance for its own sake, but stability. If the year is built from exact weeks, then appointed times remain fixed in relation to the Sabbath. Festivals do not slide through the weekdays. Sacred time does not wobble under human administration. What is observed on earth can mirror what has been ordained in heaven. The attack on other reckonings is direct. Jubilees warns against those who observe the moon in ways that throw off the seasons and confuse the holy with the common. That is not a side complaint tucked into a footnote. It is one of the book's defining polemics. In ancient Judaism, calendar disputes were never merely technical. They touched pilgrimage, harvest offerings, fasts, priestly duty, and communal identity. If one group celebrates a feast while another treats that same day as ordinary, the disagreement is not abstract. It divides the nation at the table, in the temple, and before God. Here, the historical background becomes crucial. In the Second Temple period, Jewish groups argued intensely over how sacred time should be reckoned. Jubilees stands with a stream of thought also visible at Qumran, one that wanted a fixed pattern insulated from what it saw as human corruption. In that world, lunar observation could symbolize dependence on shifting, earthly judgment. A fixed solar scheme could symbolize fidelity to the created order itself. Wednesday, the day the heavenly lights are made in Genesis, becomes especially significant as a marker within that logic. Time is not chosen, it is discovered and kept. Once that vision takes hold, the rest of the book begins to make sense. History is arranged into jubilees because time is not empty. It arrives with structure. Laws are written on heavenly tablets because revelation is not improvised. The patriarchs celebrate festivals before Sinai because those observances do not begin with human legislation. They are woven into the order of the world. Even covenant memory becomes chronological. To forget when is also, in a way, to forget who. That is why the book can sound so severe. For a modern reader, a discrepancy of days may seem tolerable. For Jubilees, it threatens the whole bond between heaven and earth. If festivals wander, then worship loses alignment. If worship loses alignment, then Israel no longer lives inside the rhythm intended from the beginning. The result is not simply mistake but disorder, a moral and cosmic failure. Sacred time becomes profane by misplacement. The people are not only late, they are out of tune. There is something powerful in that. Even for readers who do not adopt the calendar itself. Jubilees refuses the idea that time is neutral. It insists that days shape devotion and that repeated rhythms form a people. In a world of empire, displacement, and competing authorities, that insistence carried real force. A community that can still count time according to heaven has not surrendered itself entirely to kings, markets, or foreign habits. The calendar in Jubilees is a wall, a liturgy, and a declaration of independence all at once. Chapter 4 before Jubilees tells us how people ought to count their days. It tells us why days matter at all. The answer begins not with men but with heaven. In this book, angels are not distant ornaments hovering at the edge of the story. They are woven into creation, worship, judgment, and memory. The angel of the presence speaks the revelation to Moses. The angels of the presence and the angels of sanctification keep Sabbath in heaven before flesh is ever taught to keep it on earth. Festivals are not treated as local customs invented to organize human religion. They are part of a heavenly pattern into which Israel is invited. That is one of the most striking features of the book. Earthly worship is meaningful because it corresponds to something already alive above. The Sabbath, in Jubilees chapter 2, is a sign shared between God, angels, and Israel. That thought changes the emotional texture of obedience. To keep Sabbath is not only to rest from labor, It is to step into a rhythm older than nations. To mark a far feast is not merely to remember a past event. It is to join a liturgy already known in heaven. This heavenly frame also explains the book's rich angelology. Jubilees speaks of created angelic orders associated with sanctity and with the workings of the natural world. Fire, winds, clouds, darkness, snow, hail, thunder, and other forces are not imagined as random powers. They belong to an ordered creation under divine command. That does not make the book primitive in the lazy sense often used by modern critics. It makes it sacramental. The world is dense with meaning because the visible and invisible are not sealed off from one another. Set against that ordered heaven is a rival realm of rebellion and accusation. Here enters Mastema, one of the most important figures in the book's darker vision. Mastema is not exactly identical with every later idea of Satan, but he occupies a related space. He opposes, tests, accuses, and seeks room to act. Jubilees does not portray evil as an equal power battling God from a matching throne. Divine sovereignty remains intact, yet the presence of hostile spirits is treated with full seriousness. Human beings live in a contested world, and temptation is neither reduced to psychology nor dissolved into mythic color. This matters because the book is trying to explain why the human story goes wrong so repeatedly. If the calendar shows heaven's order, demonology shows the pressure against that order. If angels sanctify time, rebellious spirits distort life within time. Jubilees, therefore, offers more than chronology. It offers a moral map. Human choices are real, but they unfold amid influences, powers, and inherited patterns that extend beyond what the eye can see. Modern readers may divide sharply between what they call history and what they call worldview. Ancient writers did not always do that. For them, to describe the world faithfully meant describing both the seen and the unseen as parts of one reality. Jubilees belongs entirely to that mode. It assumes that covenant, time, ritual, and spiritual conflict all interlock. That is one reason the book mattered so much in communities that felt themselves under pressure. It named their struggle in cosmic terms without reducing it to fantasy. It told them that keeping faith on earth was participation in a larger fidelity already held in heaven. And for all its severity, there is something consoling in that vision. The Holy Order has not vanished. It has not been invented by the latest reformer. It precedes human confusion. Even when nations rage, priests fail, and communities divide, the Sabbath is still kept above. The festivals are still known. The tablets are still written. In Jubilees, history may be troubled, but heaven is not improvising. That confidence gives the book much of its strange calm, even when it is warning of corruption. Chapter 5, a single name can reveal what kind of book this is. Genesis tells the broad line of the first families, but Jubilees wants more. Cain's wife is called Awan, Seth's wife is Azura, Noah's mother is Betanos. To some readers, those names seem like small embellishments, proof that the book enjoys filling in blanks. But the impulse runs deeper than decoration. Jubilees resists anonymity. It wants the remembered world to have contour. It wants the earliest generations placed inside an ordered genealogy where lives are dated, relationships identified, and forgotten figures restored to the chain of memory. That same instinct governs its chronology. Adam, Seth, Enos, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. The ancient names do not simply pass by like markers in a distant fog. They are placed into Jubilee periods and weeks of years. This creates an impression of precision that is part of the book's theological argument. The first world was not a blur. Its history was measured from the beginning. Even before Sinai, before kings, before temple, human life unfolded with incountable sacred time. Jubilees is also interested in sharpening the moral shape of early history. Enoch, for example, becomes not only the man who walked with God but a priestly and scribal figure, associated with testimony, signs, and judgment. He is a watcher of times, almost an ideal counterpart to a world that later loses its bearings. The book consistently draws such lines. Righteousness is tied to instruction, knowledge is tied to proper order, memory is tied to obedience. Then comes the crisis of Genesis 6, the strange and unsettling episode of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Jubilees stands firmly in the ancient interpretation that these were angelic watchers who descended, transgressed their appointed bounds, and produced giant offspring. In the biblical text itself, the passage is brief and mysterious. In Second Temple literature, including Jubilees, it becomes a decisive explanation for corruption before the flood. Violence grows not only from ordinary human sin, but from a cosmic breach, a collapse of boundaries between heaven and earth that deforms creation. The flood, then, is more than weather and water. It is a cleansing judgment against a world thick with distortion. Yet even after the waters recede, the problem is not entirely gone. In one of the book's most vivid expansions, the disembodied spirits associated with the destroyed giants continue to trouble humanity. Noah prays for protection from these wicked spirits, and Mastema asks that 1/10 of them remain under his authority. The request is granted. That detail is startling, not because it solves every theological problem, but because it reveals how the author understands ongoing evil. The flood resets the human story, but it does not eliminate spiritual opposition from the world. Jubilees adds something else here that is easy to miss. Noah receives instruction in remedies. A kind of medicinal knowledge passed through angelic means to help his descendants resist harm. In that small but telling move, the book refuses to separate bodily vulnerability from sacred history. Healing belongs inside the covenant world too. Knowledge of herbs, remedies, and preservation is not treated as beneath revelation. It is part of the mercy needed for life after judgment. All of this gives the primeval story a different texture than the plain reading of Genesis alone. The silence of the early chapters is filled with chronology, names, spiritual causation, and ritual concern. Some readers welcome that. Others prefer the restraint of the biblical text. But either way, Jubilees shows what ancient interpreters were trying to do with Origins. They were not only asking what happened first, they were asking how the first age explains the world they still inhabit. Why evil feels older than memory, why worship matters, why the line between holy order and corruption must be guarded, and why forgetting the deep structure of history is itself a danger. Chapter 6. When the flood ends in Jubilees, the world does not emerge as an empty stage, waiting for nations to scatter at randoms. That word matters. Noah and his sons do more than survive. They assign lands, establish boundaries, and bind the arrangement with oath. In the logic of the book, geography is moral before it is political. Territory is not merely seized by the strong, it is apportioned under a remembered order. Shem, Ham, and Japheth are not just ancestors of peoples. They are heirs within a solemn distribution meant to keep the post-flood world from sliding back into violence and confusion. This is one of the places where Jubilees reveals its intense concern for order after catastrophe. A covenant world needs borders as well as festivals. It needs inheritance, sequence, and restraint. Later, biblical readers knew of nations spreading across the earth, but Jubilees emphasizes that this spreading was not supposed to be lawless. To cross lines wrongly is not just ambition, it can become oath-breaking. That is why figures like Nimrod take on a darker cast. In later interpretation connected with the story of Babel, the building of centralized power becomes more than imperial energy. It becomes rebellion against the divinely arranged map. Here it is important to read carefully and resist later abuses. The book's distribution of lands belongs to an ancient ethnic imagination, not to modern racial systems. It identifies regions associated with the descendants of Noah, but those associations must not be confused with later ideologies built on conquest and curse. In fact, one of the persistent distortions in later history was the misuse of Noah traditions to justify the degradation of African peoples. through the so-called curse of Ham. Jubilees does not support that later cruelty in the form it eventually took. It speaks of allocated lands and lineages, not of a charter for oppression. What the book does emphasize is that memory of origins ought to govern power. Babel becomes threatening not only because human beings gather, but because they gather in defiance, with ambition severed from obedience. The confusion of tongues is therefore not merely punishment for architecture. It is judgment on a project of human unity that refuses limits and refuses the divine ordering of nations. In a book obsessed with proper divisions, Babel is the great anti-pattern, a fusion driven by pride instead of covenant. This same post-flood world also clarifies why Jubilees speak so strongly about impurity, mixture, and fidelity to inherited ways. Once history has been washed and divided again, every fresh act of disorder feels heavier. The lesson is not xenophobia in the crude modern sense, though later readers sometimes dragged the text in that direction. The lesson, in the author's own terms, is that holiness requires distinctions. Time must be distinguished. Peoples must remember their bounds. Worship must not be blended into convenience. The line between holy and common must remain visible. That conviction helps explain why the book resonated with strict communities. A group that feels threatened by assimilation will naturally be drawn to stories where collapse begins with boundary violation and renewal begins with restored order. Jubilees provides that pattern repeatedly. The flood comes after corruption. The nations are assigned after judgment. Babel is judged when order is resisted. The point is not that history can be made pure by force. The point is that covenant life always has form, and when form is despised, confusion follows. Even if one reads the book critically, that rhythm is hard to miss. Jubilees' fears drift more than almost anything else. It fears wandering festivals, wandering loyalties, wandering borders, wandering speech. Against all of that it sets counted years, named families, written tablets, and assigned inheritances. The post-flood division of the earth is one more expression of the same desire, that the world, once broken, might still be lived in according to a remembered order rather than swallowed by appetite. Chapter 7 Abram enters the story of Jubilees already under strain. He is not first introduced as a traveler hearing a call out of nowhere. He appears as a young man arguing with idolatry inside his own father's world. That shift is one of the book's most memorable expansions. In Genesis, Abraham's break with the old life is real but spare. In Jubilees, it becomes dramatic and morally prepared. He speaks against the idols. He asks what profit there is in forms that cannot speak or save. He refuses to bow before objects carried on human shoulders. The future patriarch begins not simply as a recipient of command, but as a man whose conscience has already separated from his surroundings. That matters because it changes the meaning of his call. When the word comes to leave country and kindred, it does not fall into an empty mind. It meets a man who has already turned inwardly away from the religious order around him. In one striking scene, Abram rises by night and burns the house of idols. The act is bold, dangerous, and costly. Haran dies in the fire while trying to save them. Whether one reads that episode historical memory, interpretive legend, or theological dramatization, the point is unmistakable. Idolatry is not merely false belief. It holds a community in fear, habit, and dependence. Breaking with it has consequences. Jubilees adds another layer to Abraham's story that fits the book's larger concern with knowledge and origins. At one point, Abram studies the stars in order to understand the year and the rains, then turns away from trust in astral signs, concluding that all such matters are in the hand of the Lord. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is a rejection of cosmic dependence detached from the Creator. The world may be ordered, but the order is not a machine to be mastered by anxious reading of omens. It is the work of God. The same book that cares passionately about calendar and heavenly structure refuses to let that structure become a substitute for trust. Then comes another remarkable claim. Jubilees says that Hebrew, the tongue of creation, had ceased from the mouths of humanity after Babel, and that it was restored to Abraham so he could read the books of his fathers. That is a deeply symbolic scene. Abraham is not only moving geographically, he is being reintroduced to original language, original memory, and original vocation. The father of the covenant people becomes, in effect, a reader again. He receives not only promises but access to the deep continuity of sacred tradition. The covenant itself is also intensified in Jubilees. Circumcision is framed with exceptional force as an eternal ordinance written on heavenly tablets. The angels of the presence and the angels of sanctification stand in the background as witnesses to a holy pattern. Israel is called to mirror. The book even says that over Israel God did not appoint any angel or spirit as ruler, because God himself is their direct Lord. That is one of its strongest identity statements. Other nations may stand under mediated governance in the imagination of the text, but Israel's covenant bond is immediate and therefore weighty. What emerges is a portrait of Abraham that is more combative, more priestly, and more consciously set against the surrounding world than in the shorter biblical account. He is anti-idolatrous before departure, prayerful in uncertainty, disciplined in study, and bound into an eternal order that stretches from heaven to the household mark carried in flesh. The journey to Canaan is still there, but it has been given a longer moral prelude. In Jubilees, Abraham does not stumble into election. He steps into it through renunciation, and that may explain why the figure mattered so much to the author. A community worried about compromise needed more than a blessed ancestor. It needed an ancestor who had already learned to break with inherited error, refuse fashionable religion, and trust the God who orders the stars without being trapped inside them. Abraham becomes the model for what Jubilees itself is trying to do: recover an older fidelity by walking away from corrupted practice, even at great cost. Chapter 8. By the time Jubilees reaches Jacob and his sons, the book's interest in priesthood and purity comes fully into view. Levi rises with unusual prominence. In the biblical canon, the formal structures of priesthood take their public shape later, especially through Aaron and the Sinai legislation. Jubilees, however, pushes priestly significance backward into the patriarchal age. It treats Levi as marked out in advance, linked to sacred service in a way that makes the later priesthood feel less like a new arrangement and more like the unfolding of something ancient. This backward extension is not accidental. The author wants continuity. He wants the cultic life of Israel to appear rooted not only in Mosaic command, but in the inner logic of the patriarchal story. The fathers did not live in a ritual vacuum waiting for law to arrive. They were already keeping festivals, already observing distinctions, already acting in ways that anticipate the temple world. In that sense, Jubilees does for priesthood what it does for the calendar. It relocates the source of holy order further back, closer to creation and covenant origins. Jacob's household is therefore not merely a family drama. It becomes a testing ground for holiness, inheritance, and chosen service. The tribal world of tents, marriages, rival mothers, flocks, migrations, and blessings is not romanticized. It is morally charged. Decisions about marriage partners, about burial, about oaths, and about loyalty carry covenant weight. The author writes as someone who sees family structure itself as one of the vessels through which sacred identity survives. This is also why Jubilees often sound stricter than Genesis on intermarriage and separation from surrounding peoples. Modern readers can find that hard, and sometimes rightly so, especially when later ages weaponized such themes. But historically, the book is speaking from a context where small communities feared absorption. Purity language in text like this is not only about ritual obsession, it is about survival through distinction. To the author, losing clear boundaries meant losing the covenant story itself. The exaltation of Levi should also be read within the politics of the Second Temple period. Priesthood was not a neutral subject. It involved lineage, temple authority, legitimacy, and the question of whether the current religious leadership truly embodied divine intention. A book that glorifies ancient priestly roots may also be critiquing later priestly failures by implication. If the pure line begins earlier and stands under heavenly confirmation, then current institutions can be measured against that ideal and found wanting. This helps explain the emotional force of the book. Jubilees is not content to admire the patriarchs. It recruits them. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Levi become witnesses for a vision of Israel that is disciplined, ordered, and unblended. They are drawn into the author's present struggle. That is not manipulation so much as the ancient art of making origins speak to crisis. Every contested community does this in some form. Jubilees does it with unusual thoroughness, yet the result is not dry legalism alone. There is a human note beneath the structure. The preservation of names, the careful dating of births, the linking of households to covenant memory, all of it suggests a writer who knows that identity is carried in families before it is argued in schools. If the nation is to endure, sons must remember fathers, and daughters must not vanish from sacred memory, and households must know where they stand in the long measured story. For Jubilees, holiness is not an idea floating above ordinary life. It is carried through tents, marriages, marks in flesh, counted weeks, and the transmission of duty from one generation to the next. Chapter 9 at the end. The book returns us to Moses, but now the mountain looks different. We have walked from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham through the fathers to the threshold of Israel's inheritance. The sweep is enormous, yet the logic has been consistent. Time is ordered. Heaven is involved, covenant is ancient, disobedience is distortion. Revelation does not begin at Sinai so much as arrive there in concentrated form, gathering the whole past into a readable pattern. Moses becomes the recipient not merely of law, but of an interpreted history. In Jubilees, the Exodus world itself is also shadowed by spiritual conflict. Mastema stands behind opposition. The deliverance of Israel is not only a contest with Pharaoh, but part of a wider struggle over who rules the covenant people. That fits the book's habit of viewing earthly events through heavenly and demonic dimensions. It also prepares the reader for the final movement toward the land. When Israel reaches Canaan at the close of the Great Jubilee pattern, the ending feels less like a stopping point than a confirmation. The measured history has arrived where it was meant to arrive. And yet the deepest legacy of Jubilees may lie beyond its own closing scene. The book helps us understand the religious atmosphere that surrounded later Judaism and early Christianity. Its demonology makes the world of exorcism narratives feel less abrupt. Its angelology shows how crowded the unseen world could be in Jewish imagination. Its concern for appointed times helps explain fierce disputes over calendars and purity. Its reverence for written heavenly tablets reveals a culture of piety in which law, liturgy, and cosmic order could not easily be separated. At the same time, the book teaches caution. It asks to be read with sympathy, but also with discipline. Some of its claims rest directly on its own narrative authority, rather than on the shorter biblical text. Some expansions became influential traditions. Others remained local or contested. Some details can be compared with parallel ancient writings. Others remain uncertain or survive through layers of translation that require patient scholarly work. To acknowledge that is not to diminish the book. It is to respect it enough not to force certainty where the evidence does not allow it. What then is the Book of Jubilees? It is not just a lost book, and not just an extra set of stories. It is a sustained attempt to build a world in which creation, calendar, covenant, angels, households, priesthood, and national destiny all fit together. It reflects the anxieties and hopes of a Jewish community determined to defend sacred order against corruption. It preserves traditions treasured in Ethiopia and confirmed in ancient Hebrew fragments from Qumran. It stands at the edge of the biblical canon for many readers, but near the center of Second Temple imagination. That may be why it continues to draw attention. It does something many texts do not dare to do. It claims that time itself can be faithful or unfaithful. It claims that worship is not local invention but participation in heavenly reality. It claims that the gaps in remembered history matter, because forgetting names, seasons, and boundaries eventually becomes forgetting God. One does not have to accept every claim the book makes in order to feel the force of that vision. So the mountain scene that opened this story remains the right place to end. Moses stands between heaven and a restless people. Below him is a nation still learning how to live. Above him is the voice that measures generations, appoints days, remembers the dead, and binds earth to a pattern older than kings. The Book of Jubilees survives because, for those who treasured it, that pattern was never a theory. It was the difference between drift and order, between a forgotten past and a sanctified one, between a people merely surviving in history and a people taught how to live inside sacred time.